Hello and welcome to this CNBC Africa special program. My name is Godfrey Mutizwa. Now, the 55th annual meeting of the World Economic Forum convenes in the Swiss mountain resort of Davos under the theme this year, Collaboration for the Intelligent Age. More than 2,000 participants, among them heads of state, business leaders and social activists, are expected to take part in more than 100 sessions built around 5 key pillars: industries for the intelligent age, reimagining growth, rebuilding trust, safeguarding the planet, and investing in people. With me today are Gulam Balim, Chief Economist, Standard Bank Group, and Business Unity South Africa CEO Designate Kulekani Mate to discuss Africa's place and interest at Davos 2025. Gentlemen, thank you for your time and welcome. Let me begin with you, Kulekani. From a broad business perspective, when you look at the issues that they are tackling at Davos this year and you connect them to your agenda here in South Africa, just help me understand a little bit what you hope the team that goes to Davos will be able to achieve.
Thanks, Godfrey. Just to remind you of something that you know, which is that, of course, in a couple of days' time, South Africa takes the presidency of the G20. So this is a special Davos meeting for South Africa because we go there as president of the G20, and so there will be a great deal of attention on South Africa. South Africa will be sort of driving a lot of policy dialogues around policies that we need in the G20 countries and, dare I say, the globe. So we hope that the team that goes out there, amongst other things, of course, amongst participating, also helps generate the interest in our presidency, promote our presidency, and what we hope to achieve during South Africa's presidency of the G20. From a business point of view, we will also have a team that will be promoting the B20 because, of course, we chair the B20 during the sort of 2025 year. This is the business side of the G20. And again, we will go out there to really get business leaders to be excited about our presidency, participate, come to South Africa for the meetings that will be taking place here. So South Africa will certainly be the focus of attention, I think, and we would hope in this year's Davos, and we will certainly make an effort for that to be the case.
When you look at the key themes that they are building the conversations around this year, is there one that excites you in particular?
So the theme of collaboration, I mean, the overall theme of collaboration is an important one for us in South Africa, given where we are. We've gone through a period in which the relationship between business and government wasn't great. But since sort of last year, we've seen a huge improvement leading to a partnership that we now have with government, working on some specific areas, and there's huge appetite for business and government to participate in a whole range of areas to try and address challenges and problems like in water, municipal infrastructure and such like. And so we think that firstly, I mean, we've seen some improvements in the energy generation area, and so we think the partnership, the collaboration does hold a promise for South Africa. And so that is a theme for leaders, world leaders, business and government to really collaborate in solving global challenges is an important one.
Absolutely. Gulam, let me bring you in here. You are the big picture guy. And I want you to put on your big picture hat and look at this year's Davos themes. The main one is Kulekani is mentioning that collaboration is one in particular that interests him. But when you look at what they have put on the table here, and you look at the kind of issues that the world is dealing with, let me get your thoughts, one, in relation to that agenda, and then we can always then connect it to Africa.
Godfrey, so as one would expect, these are themes of our time. There are several significant structural forces that are at play. It's more than just incrementalism. So to the extent that we're now entering seemingly a period of geopolitical contention, a fractious geopolitical environment. The world seems to be in retreat, either in terms of geographical lines or ideological lines. That, of course, is spilling over into the economic landscape. And words and phrases such as economic fragmentation, the recall of supply chains, the reconfiguration of global alliances. So these are items of our time, alongside fragmentation in terms of the rules-based world.
Right.
And that's causing us to reset and recalibrate. And I suspect that it's certainly going to be an ambitious program in Davos, as it is going to be an ambitious but necessary program when South Africa assumes the helm of the G20.
Yeah. And when you look into the sub-themes, again, your broad thoughts just in terms of their realignment and the realities that we face on the continent?
So there's an attempt, at least by the WEF, dare I say, and sounding a little bit acerbic, to be relevant.
Sure.
Relevant in the sense that there is this resounding call for the remaking of alliances around the world, the relevance of the IMF, the World Bank.
Yeah.
And one can argue that the WEF, not to give it a sort of a more globular status, but it also needs to revisit its agenda and its process. And the WEF doesn't entirely carry legitimacy, particularly in the eyes of the emerging world.
Sure.
So this idea of forging alliances, recalibrating for an integrated world seems to be an attempt to push back against fragmentation, taking into consideration these other sweeping trends such as digitalization and the various network industry tech teams that are enveloping us.
Absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about the fragmentation aspect at a global level, because I think all of us, we haven't mentioned it yet, but we of course have to mention it at some stage, watched what happened in the United States with interest, let me put it that way, and what it potentially means for the alliances as we know them, and you spoke about where we're coming from, and what kind of alliances will be required into the future. I'll start with you.
So, I mean, an interesting sort of development, I'll call it, in the recent couple of days, weeks perhaps, was the announcement by the Minister of International Relations, Minister Lamola, yes, about a process of trying to align our foreign policy with our economic interests as a country.
One of my favorite stories, I'll tell you that.
and of course, as you can imagine, we all said hallelujah in business, because we have decried the fact that, you know, often our foreign policy positions that we take were either at odds or at least put into jeopardy our economic interests. So we think that that's an important one, because South Africa has for a very long time professed to be non-aligned, and we think that that's a correct position, by the way. We are a very small economy. We cannot afford to align with a particular grouping and not align with others. So we think the non-aligned stance is a correct foreign policy stance.
Okay.
And so we think that attempt at aligning foreign policy and economic interests of the country is an important one. So we cannot afford to upset anybody. We need to make sure that we keep very good relations with everybody in the interest of trade for South Africa.
Is that at the national level only, or does that get better when you look at it from a continental perspective?
I think it is important at a continental level as well, because we're not as integrated as we should be, right? So we are a bloc of 54 countries, but it's not like anybody wanting to trade with Africa essentially trades with all of Africa at the moment as things stand, because we've got different rules in each of the countries, etc. So it still matters what relationships and alignments. Of course, the efforts at least from a trade point of view, greater integration within the continent would make, would one, strengthen the voice of the continent and make it a significant bloc that can speak and be listened to.
Yeah. So we have more work at the continental level. Gulam, your take, in particular, I also wanted to ask you whether you agree with the non-alignment when you look at the kind of alliances that South Africa, before we move on to the continent, currently has in place.
If I could rephrase it somewhat differently, but an active neutrality.
Active neutrality.
And this plays to the underpin of being non-aligned and placing economic interests at the forefront. But the active element is in the sense that this doesn't mean that South Africa forsakes the underpin to its constitution. Right. Its historical associations with nations around the world. A deep history, particularly given the searing history that South Africa had to suffer under apartheid. So this active neutrality is a tilt for South Africa, because if you consider, for instance, around the Lady R episode and prior to that, many would say and accuse South Africa of having been clumsy in the manner in which we managed international relations. And in fact, if anything, since that Lady R matter, there's been this decided turning point to a more managed, a more precise, and a more considered international relations dimension.
I like your choice of words, clumsy handling. So, okay. So active neutrality, you're saying, and you're saying there appears to be a realism that's taking place. I also would like your thoughts on what we are doing at a continental level, and perhaps what we should be doing when we go to Davos at a continental level to try to project and protect the interests of the continent.
So I would just say this, and we've mentioned G20 several times in the sense of South Africa assuming the presidency imminently, and we know it takes the baton from Brazil, and Brazil took the baton from India. So in a sense, you've got 3 consecutive years where fairly significant emerging markets, if South Africa can be included within that paradigm, are at the helm of shaping the global agenda. Now, I have no doubt that South Africa will have a continental underpin to its proposition. It's always been South Africa's case that we don't really pretend to be the big brother on the continent and patronizing in that respect, but at the same time do seek to carry the international aspirations of the continent, given the heft that South Africa does have in terms of international conversations and fora such as the G20.
A little more, you're saying?
Well, we have, if one considers, for instance, Africa only accounts for about 4.5% of global GDP. It houses roughly 17% of humanity.
Sure.
But Africa doesn't, through its economic substance, have the ability to be, to put it quite candidly, significant in the world. But nations around the world, and perhaps foremost China, realized more than 2 decades ago that while Africa may not lend economic heft to China's ambitions in the big picture scheme and more immediately, what it does lend is 54 countries that gives it credibility and weight within global discussions, for instance, surrounding climate change. And so Africa brings that diplomatic heft, and nations like South Africa serve as the beachhead in these conversations. So I think our G20 presidency will be an enveloping one, a continental one. And in that respect, items such as the free trade agreement, combined with, I think, a recognition that South Africa is not the sole gateway onto the continent. Kenya is formidable in this respect, and recent engagements between the Kenyan leadership and the United States, for example, at a state visit-led level to the United States, speaks to the prominence of other nations. I could go so far as to say even some Middle East zones like Dubai act as a gateway into the continent. So it's with the idea that South Africa can play a role because of historical reasons, and it is a big country within Sub-Saharan Africa GDP-wise.
Yeah.
It carries the hopes of the continent. It doesn't have the conceit of believing that it is the sole dynamo.
Right.
And I think that's going to shape our engagements at G20, at Davos,
Yeah.
which is really around, I would suspect, dealing with unemployment and poverty, pricing over international markets with
Yeah.
regard to Africa gaining access to those markets.
Yeah.
It is going to be about realigning the world in terms of representation.
Absolutely. And on that front, we lost a friend in Biden because he supported Africa's place in the UN Security Council with 2 permanent positions. I doubt that the incoming administration, when they come in, are going to say, yes, we're supporting Africa coming to the UN Security Council with 2 permanent members. It's going to be interesting to watch that one. Then, of course, to your point about other various points of entry into the continent other than South Africa, we've got the Lobito corridor out on the west now that's being built, and hopefully that will succeed. But someone was making the point very interesting the other day that it should not just be a way of siphoning the resources of the continent out, but actually work in terms of increasing the industrialization of the continent and adding beneficiation.
No, indeed. It has been the aspiration for a long time that there needs to be value add.
Yeah.
Africa, generally speaking, is light industry. There's pockets of heavy industry. If you look at continental-wide, Egypt and South Africa perhaps carry the heaviest heavy industry burden.
Yeah.
Morocco also has a decent, for example, auto industry. But everywhere else it's sparse. And it's sparse for a variety of reasons, aside from the politics and intermating with economics, but also power, shortages, and the lack of scale. Addressable markets where there is buying power, and there's not many addressable markets on the continent given general levels of low income, and so foreign markets are prized.
Sure.
And I think, to speak to your opening point very briefly, the United States does appear to be tilting towards a hawkish build the wall paradigm, an isolationist paradigm. When I say build the wall, I mean building a wall between the United States and Mexico in terms of people movement, in terms of immigration, building a wall in terms of trade frictions and tariffs that are going to
Taxing
be
the world
imposed.
for their problems.
Well, they'll be raising tariffs on China and the rest of the world, but they will be taxing Americans who will end up paying a higher price for imported goods. Build the wall in terms of the historical transatlantic allyship between the US and Europe. I think that is going to fray. And maybe the last one that I would mention, building a wall between global constructive climate ambitions and America's climate ambitions under its incoming president, which is going to be fractious.
And he's called it a hoax. Let's talk about the role of the private sector. Klekan, let me come to you. When we speak about these international things coming and affecting our economies, I happen to be a little bit older, so I grew up in a generation where when you looked at the continent, what you found were various types of government in places. You had those that were clearly capitalist, let me call it that way. So you can talk about Kenya, you can talk about Nigeria. There was never any ambiguity at all about the kind of system that they wanted to put in place in the country. Then you came to Southern Africa, you had the socialist Angola, socialist Zimbabwe, socialist Mozambique, Ujamaa in Tanzania. When you hear now about increasing the role of the private sector or the place of the private sector in building the alliances and the economies that we need for the future, what comes to mind?
Well, I think that firstly, personally, and certainly from the private sector point of view, we welcome that openness to a greater role for the private sector in these issues, industries of the future, etc., but also in fixing what is currently broken that used to work before, right? I mean, in South Africa, we obviously went through a difficult period in which misgovernance and all of that created a situation that we find ourselves in where infrastructure is broken, many things don't work. We now have a looming water crisis, if you like. What is also clear is that the government doesn't have the capacity to fix the problem on its own.
Sure.
The human capacity and the financial capacity. In the case of South Africa in particular, we have high levels of debt that doesn't allow us to really spend more on infrastructure. So our spending is totally going in the wrong direction, by and large. I mean, there is an attempt by the National Treasury to really refocus our spending, etc. So given that as a context, the recognition of a greater role for the private sector, in terms of providing skills that are necessary and general capabilities, and the financing, the operations of some of these network infrastructure industries is absolutely critical. So that shift, I think, is most welcome, because what it has meant, I think, the kind of holding on to those ideologies of a state-led development has meant that
the 5-year plans.
So I was responsible for writing, together with many others, the National Development Plan. So in some ways, I am sort of part of that generation that believes in central planning. But the reality is that the capacity that we have in the country has been underutilized as governments focus on what government can do alone, for that matter. And so you see what happens in municipalities. The change, at least in mindset and rhetoric, suggests that we are going to better utilize all of the resources that we have in the country to address our problem. That can only be good. And that should be extended to many, many sectors, by the way, where there's clearly a mismatch in terms of the capacity within the state and the private sector to address it. I mean, one of those would be the national health insurance would be one.
I hear you. And I wanted to come in and say to you, so when this whole debate about collaboration between government and the private sector started, one of my questions that I always asked was around, are we getting private sector into government by stealth here, ruled by the private sector, unelected as they are, and we know what they pursue? When do we say this is where we stop? What kind of guardrails do we need to ensure that the electorate's will is implemented while at the same time making things work?
Absolutely. So we have no such ambitions of taking the government's responsibility, right? Government must do its work. What we're doing really is finding opportunities where we can support the government, in some instances build the capacity of government to do what it's supposed to do, so that we can carry on with business. Why we're doing this is primarily because the lack of capacity on the part of government has a significant impact on our ability to do business. And so we can do, so there's a little bit of self-interest here, but we think that in the process society benefits. So there is no attempt by the private sector to take over the role of government.
Come in, Gulam, and I know you want to come in because, interestingly, the Americans are stealing our model, right? So Elon Musk is going to come with his government efficiency department, whatever it's supposed to do. But I wanted to ask you the question directly. Does the South African model lend itself perhaps on the continent? And to what extent do you think it could be panel beaten so it increases the ability of the private sector to help where it is required?
Godfrey,
You can also answer the question as to whether it is desirable.
I would argue that capitalism is the least worst form of economic practice, economic ideology. In other words, it has its shortcomings. It's undeniable. And many of its shortcomings is typically neglectful of those that are most vulnerable. Having said that, when I say it is the least worst, I would argue still stands triumphantly across all other methods of socioeconomic choices, socialism, communism. But capitalism has evolved, and even though there are those that assail it unreservedly, you have, for example, in South Africa, a very substantial social safety net that it has been built over 3 decades. so as to address many of the shortcomings with regard to social exclusion. You also have the capacity to regulate the private sector, regulations that would otherwise cause the private sector to tilt in a direction that they wouldn't.
Yeah.
So, for example, telecom networks reaching to the poor.
Sure.
So it's not a static, it is an evolving process. But sometimes, and as I would argue the case in South Africa, it is not the private sector that is aggressively inserting itself in terms of one of the pillars that guides the economy.
Yeah.
It is quite simply public sector failure. It is balance sheet failure where they've mismanaged public finances and quite simply need liquidity. It is a public sector in South Africa that we colloquially refer to as failing state within public sector capacities. And so private sector resources are brought to bear and private sector skills are brought to bear.
Sure.
So in South Africa, in a sense, I would argue the private sector is playing a rescue role. But having said that, while there's this rescue role, it is within the confines of a heavy state hand and a constructive state hand in many respects. And I think if the private sector is able to deliver results, especially within the envelope of the government of national unity, it serves as a model where there's some checks and balances of a historic and legacy nature that may still deliver a favorable result.
Absolutely. What about my other question? This model, could we export it to the continent?
So in many parts of the continent with local nuance, you're exactly seeing this emerge as well. Remember that you have, and I don't say it in a welcoming way, the IMF is involved in around 25 countries on the continent, meaning that the IMF is the balance sheet in town. It is providing liquidity. And of course, when you get the IMF coming around, they instill their guardrails and their reformist agenda. So there's many African countries that are, call it under duress, that are finding themselves having to enact a reform agenda, bring in the private sector, lessen government's unconstructive hand, correct fiscal excesses, for example. So I think there is, maybe on the continent, regrettably, roughly 20 years since the big debt forgiveness in the mid-noughties, that we find ourselves with, let's call it generally, government excess that is now being restored, either by the private sector or multilateral initiatives or both.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's interesting because you are suggesting, therefore, that where perhaps you do not have a private sector that's strong enough, your international agencies come in and lend a hand. But if perhaps it could be turned the other way around and get the private sector to be involved, that might not be a bad thing. But I was going to ask you further and ask the question, do we always need to formalize it like we have done here?
So formalization can come about through growth agenda policies. In South Africa, that level of formalization, for example, is captured within the work streams between the private sector and the presidency. To a degree, Operation Vulindlela, which admittedly is a, let's call it, an engagement between the presidency and the national treasury, but which also informally throws its arm around the private sector. So I guess how you formalize is rather than necessarily throwing the private sector, which can have its engagements with government. When the growth agenda is cast in a particular manner where these actors, these role players are brought in and are participants, that formality then, in a sense, as you refer to it, ensues. And I think in South Africa, it's beginning to be constructive quite simply because, as I've said earlier, government is liquidity shy, and we have this incapacitated state, which, if anything, has destroyed economic potential.
Absolutely. You want to come in, Kulekan?
I fully agree with Gulam here that this isn't the private sector trying to insert itself, rather.
It's required.
It is required. It's been requested. And, by the way, he references Operation Vulindlela. It's a really important initiative because it's doing the work that should have been done 10, 15 years ago. We've known for a very long time that we've got some structural impediments to growth in South Africa and that we need structural reforms. And so Operation Vulindlela has been really great at tackling those structural reforms and doing so in a way that uses the capacity of the state where such exists, but also draws on the private sector. And more importantly, in the case of energy, reforming that sector such that you now have a much more, or will in future have a much more competitive energy sector than we had before. So all of these are welcome because they now become laws of the country, etc., etc. So this is great.
It's a good thing. So because you're using all your resources to the maximum possible efficiency levels that you can get. Let me start with you, Gulam, this time in terms of these industries that we keep talking about that we say will be necessary for the future. I think we have seen the transformations, especially if you're talking about AI. I don't know if I say in the last 2 years, would I be correct? Talk to me a little bit about what you would want a platform like Davos to add to the discourse on AI and its impact on our economies.
Godfrey, so even though AI has captured our imagination over the last roughly 2 years, when ChatGPT perhaps more formidably entered the realm in the early summer of 2023. However, within this notion of intelligent age, what I would argue is there's a few other network industries as well. So there is the metaverse, there's quantum computing, there is immersive reality technologies. And I think it represents perhaps two things. One, the Internet of Things, which is what we have been immersed in for the last 3 decades or so, and which has been pretty meaningful in propelling global economic growth, is largely mature. So the Internet as a source of growth thrust is probably beginning to ebb. And now these new technologies, and I would emphasize even more than artificial intelligence, potent as it is, quantum computing could be what drives the next S-curve in development.
Explain the concept again a little bit.
So by S-curve, what we mean is that there arrives a technology which begins to be injects itself into society. It's novel, there's adoption, people begin to test and tease with it, and then it becomes more widespread. It begins to meaningfully impact in the operations, commerce, scale, and efficiencies, widespread adoption, and it generates what we would call an S-curve of development. In other words, accelerated development over, say, several years, maybe even decades, before petering out. And that technology or that level of infrastructure, for example, a railway system, it peters out in the sense that it contributes to society, but it doesn't have that growth driving momentum. So broadly, technology is now providing this opportunity for buttressing global growth. And as I've suggested, my bias is towards quantum computing as a thrust while not diminishing the other technologies. The thing about this is that, of course, it's a form of creative destruction. So there are going to be winners and there are going to be losers, as is the case with respect to most shifts in society. The concern is that the winners could become ever more concentrated, ever more fewer in proportion.
And we're already seeing it.
And we're seeing it. And those that are being displaced are swelling. The very fact that you have 7 firms within the S&P 500 that are so dominant speaks to the concentration of wealth, the concentration of income, the concentration of fewer individuals garnering outsized benefits, whereas most others. So this tension between the rich and the poor will be amplified. And these are the socioeconomic things that we're grappling with. This is what Brazil attempted to also grapple with in terms of unemployment and poverty. So talking about new industries in this digital age, I would have added the idea of the shared notion in terms of which industries emerge with a consciousness surrounding shared development. And I fear this isn't sufficiently grasped. It's insufficiently inserted into the agenda. not out of sheer neglect,
Yeah.
but I think quite simply because we're entering an accelerating race
Yeah.
into the unknown. These technologies are propelling us
Yeah.
at rapid speed, accelerating speed,
Yeah.
and we don't quite know how it is going to alter
Yeah.
the global economy, global politics,
Yeah.
shape geopolitics as well.
Yeah.
And while we're grappling with that unknown, we're also trying to think about shared prosperity.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
this is the quest of our time.
Absolutely. And you reminded me one of the phrases you used in a talk that you gave where I was listening to you, where you talk about acceleration, but now you were contrasting it with some of the glacial change that we see across the continent. And I'm mentioning it mindful that we've got snow falling behind us. And of course, those who are going to Davos, we're going to have that snow. Kulekan, come in from a private sector perspective. You represent the biggest component of South African industry. What are your members looking forward to when we speak about artificial intelligence? Knowing you guys don't like to be regulated as such, you want the free enterprise spirit to take your members and take them where opportunity lies.
So let me avoid your question deliberately and start by saying that, agreeing with Gulam, that you have these developments taking place and absolutely critical for growth and development across the globe. What we're finding is that our ability to really benefit as an economy from tech developments and all of that are taking place around the globe is limited or slowed down by lack of digital skills in this economy.
Right.
We're just not producing enough digital skills that would enable us and empower existing industries as well as future industries. That is becoming a huge challenge in two ways. Of course, some of these can be sourced from other countries, which means that jobs that could be created here are created somewhere else because we do not have that capabilities. And it ranges from entry-level skills to really highly specialized skills. And we think that as part of preparing ourselves, as part of making sure that we can participate, we can take advantage of these developments, we actually need to invest in skills. Our skills architecture in the country, the system, the regime is so archaic.
And it's interesting because that's one of the pillars that they are focusing on at WEF, investing in people.
Yes.
Does that sound like you are suggesting that perhaps that is one pillar that ought to be added to the collaboration between the government and the private sector?
Undoubtedly. We certainly have to invest in people. I mean, in a strange sort of way, in the context of South Africa, we started this collaboration responding to a crisis, right? We had the longest or the most number of days of load shedding in 2022, 2023. So it was a crisis. Firms couldn't produce because they only had electricity for 4 hours a day. So it was a crisis, and we then collaborated. We're now out of the sort of crisis period. We need to look at how we make these gains more sustainable.
Yeah.
And it can only be through the people. I mean, the chairman of Eskom says most of the time that you cannot turn around Eskom from the outside.
Right.
You need the people of Eskom to do that.
Yeah.
And so he's making an important point about investing in people.
Yeah.
But investing in people throughout the economy is absolutely critical, and we would agree that needs to be. And we need to be open to new ways of doing things from a point of view of these investments. And it doesn't help to say one thing and recognize this as a problem and still hold on to the archaic models of skills development, how you construct and approve qualification. As it happens, by the way, it takes something like 3-4 years for a qualification that's conceived to be approved. By the time it's approved, it's dated.
It's obsolete. I remember someone saying that, when you look at accounting, some of the modules that we are seeing today were developed in the 1950s or 1960s. But let's park that one. Gulam, I wanted to pick up on a point that you made about some of the key things that should have been on the agenda in Davos when we're talking about these industries that are relevant for the future. I don't know if you want to expand that a little bit.
Of course. So I think there will always be some bedrock industrial activity and bedrock primary economic activity. By that I mean, for example, farming and mining. These are the seeds of an economy, and if anything, there's also a geopolitical tinge with regard to how some nations are seeking to procure land to ensure that they have food stock supply. So there's vulnerability with respect to water. That obviously is a subset of the climate change dynamic, combined with food security and just geopolitical fragmentation that can challenge supply chains and stymie, for example, delivery of foods, as we saw hampered during COVID. So agriculture is significant, and I think that provides much of Africa for continued opportunity, given that we all know 60% of arable land, the world's arable land is accessible. I would just add that roughly 90% of African agriculture, conceding that a good share of that is subsistence, but 90% is rainfall dependent, which is what then introduces precarious farming. And amidst climate change, it only elevates the level of vulnerability and volatility. So investment in agriculture through irrigation, for example, is a significant can-do that just substantially reduces production risk. In terms of resources, abundant resources, particularly resources that are required for renewables energy. And I think industrial nationalism is coming to the fore. Supply chain recalibration away from just in time to just in case. Meaning COVID highlighted you need to have continuity of supply, you need to have going concern, reliability. And so supply chains that are reordering, redistributing for continuity rather than just perfect, efficient and timely delivery means that Africa can probably step up. And the power industry for me is significant because it's oxygen for an economy. So as many African countries, particularly on the back of now this renewable impetus at the same time address power shortage, I think that would be monumental in just giving general flourish to industrialization. Then the last point I would make, when we talk about industries, services sectors tend to be quite big in many economies. But services, for the most part, and I'm exaggerating a little bit, are derived. They are derived off an industrial base. So accounting services, legal services, at its most vanilla level, describing services. As I say, take their cue from the primary and the secondary sectors of an economy. They're derived, and of course they provide value added back and reinforce an innate strength. So Africa, if I could suggest, is in a catch-up state. Catch up with regard to per capita incomes, people going up the income ladder and shifting from basic goods consumption to heightened levels of discretionary spending. And around that, it just speaks to the capacity for primary, secondary and tertiary activity to develop. So I sound like I'm giving, I hope not glib, but an answer that says the sectors in their whole are ripe for development on the continent. There's no maturity. However, that balance between local content and importation needs to alter. Africans consume what Africans don't produce, to sound a little bit colloquial, and we need to alter that.
Absolutely. I've heard that saying, and it's always fascinated me. Africans eat what they don't produce and produce what they don't eat. We export the raw materials and then we import food. We spend billions of dollars importing the food. So the discussion has by extension morphed into the discussion on industries of the future. Growth drivers of the future. And I think you've expanded on that. I want Kulekani to come in as well on your thoughts around what kind of new, let's call it engines we need to get growth going again into the future. And that should be part of the agenda when these guys go and talk in Davos.
I like what he said about sort of moving from kind of production system of just in time to just in case. I actually love that. Because in a way, it has spawned the debates about what kinds of industries we ought to have in the various economies, just in case the supply chains are interrupted in the way that they were during COVID, and obviously also in the geopolitical developments that are taking place. That raises a couple of questions of just how, I mean, philosophically it kind of makes sense, right? Self-sufficiency and all of that.
Yeah.
But are we driving towards indirectly some sort of form of import substitution policies that say, well, you know, let's try and produce everything for ourselves in our own economies so that we are less reliant on others from outside. I mean, there is a big question about, as we know from the history of the economic history, import substitution policies have not been very successful. And so whether we will be able to really calibrate our policies in a way that takes the best out of this just in case, but avoids the worst. Yeah. So that's one part. But linked to that, of course, is that a topic that you said we would get to, climate change also challenges production in various ways. Food production and so on. Yeah. And so we need to think very hard about, on the one hand, how do we make sure that there's continuous production of food for the continent in this era of climate change. Yeah. And it seems to me that to a granular level of how do you make sure that you get yields when you have unpredictable sort of climate level rainfalls and all of that stuff. And to be able to do that, we do require specialized technologies that assist us in doing that. So I see huge opportunities in creating industries of the future, just in the food production space, let alone everything else.
And that's an interesting one, actually, because a weekend ago, a friend of mine took me out to a place just outside Johannesburg. This guy is on a small farm. I think he said it's 700 hectares, or is it 700 acres? I think it's 700 hectares. And what he has done there is he's got a small dam. And he says with this dam and the water system and irrigation system that he has built, he says, I can withstand 4 years of drought while still producing. And perhaps those are the technologies that you are talking about, and we need to invest in them. We need to talk a little bit about climate change, and I wanted to ask the question, what kind of conversation do we need at Davos on climate change? COP29 has just come and gone. People have described the deal reached there. Some people said it's a cop-out. I think they were maybe playing around whatever. Because they are saying there's not enough commitment nor enough resources that are coming through from the West. On the other side, others are saying this is the best that we can do, especially when you consider the man who's coming to the White House in 2025. I'll start with you, Gulam.
Look, so firstly, 2050 has been sort of the organizing concept to get a voluntary commitment by countries around the world to a particular target. Coming out of COP29, at the minimum, a few things can be said. One, the 2050 targets need to be brought forward because we're losing the climate battle. The extent of heat that is enveloping the world is exceeding what many anticipated.
Just last night, I don't know if you felt the heat last night.
This backdrop certainly is contrasting. So we need to be more ambitious in terms of and recognizing that we're not doing enough. The battle is being lost, firstly. Secondly, we have an incoming president of the United States who is a naysayer. The reality, though, is when the United States is imbibed in the Paris 2050, it effectively means that the countries that are vested in the 2050 ambition amount to those that generate 89% of greenhouse emissions. So, if the United States withdraws, clearly it's a meaningful subtraction from that very lofty 89% commitment. And it does appear that that is plausible under President Trump imminently. So the third leg I would talk about is simply funding. there's always not been the level of funding emerging in terms of especially supporting emerging markets, both in terms of adaptation and mitigation. The fourth item I would mention, and you said cop out, scapegoating. China is often suggested to be a significant contributor to the greenhouse gas emission quantum. And it is true that China is the world's largest emitter.
Right.
But it's conversations like what I just offered now that are mistruths when you consider that per capita, it is the United States that exceed all else.
Right.
It is the United States that, in terms of discretionary consumption, generates a great deal of greenhouse gas emissions. Just think about travel, international travel, or even continental travel in the United States. So when there are these choice arguments that seek to shift responsibility and also stymie the catch-up status of many emerging markets and use data to propel arguments, it delivers weak outcomes, such as what we've seen now at the 29th edition of the climate summit called COP29.
Absolutely.
And I think when we cast a light on that, we begin to see progress. I'll just conclude by saying 60% of vehicles in China are not ICE vehicles, are vehicles that are either hybrid or rely singularly on batteries. And that supersedes Europe and the United States, both of which are less than 20% in terms of adoption. Some are 10%. And yet China is the culprit, so to speak. Now, I'm not here to defend China and to foster allyship, but merely just to say there is a level of disingenuous dimension to much of these conversations. But through the global south, through South-South chords, if there is some level of unified opinion and movement, I think, not to say we can move without Europe or the United States, but it galvanizes this position. Coming back to my point, 54 nations not being in global GDP, not a huge emitter, per capita probably growing, but at the same time, this allyship begins to cast the conversation in a potentially more integrous way.
Yeah, absolutely. And you make a point that I was going to make about the fact that we've got this change that's taking place in the United States politically that may well render some of the conversations that we are having now perhaps not obsolete, but certainly weaken them. Kulekani, your take?
Again, the point about our 2050 ambition from a cooling the earth, as it were, or preventing the heating up of the earth is an important one. We're just not winning the war. That is very clear. We see this every day. And so keeping the temperature rises to 1 degree is clearly out of reach. And so it is a concern. If now we're experiencing this, the very likelihood that big players in the global economy are likely to withdraw from these commitments is a huge concern. But that said, I think it's a conversation also that we need to bring home. What it actually means for us as a people in South Africa, on the African continent. We are stuck in South Africa with the debates around, obviously, power generation is one of our yes, and so the questions about just energy transition and all of that are important, absolutely important. But I think we also, alongside that, we need to be thinking about what are the industries of the future that we can create, which make the debates not about losers from the transition. For as long as people see the transition as we will lose jobs because there are no other prospects, it makes it difficult. In this country, I would imagine everywhere else. And so I think the conversation about what do we do to make sure that we create the industries of the future that replace the jobs that are lost in these sectors that need to transition, auto manufacturing, et cetera, are important, or just as important.
And we need to insert that into the agenda. Kulekani, thank you for your time. Gulab, thank you for for your time. That's our conversation on the key conversations that are going to be taking place in Davos and what they mean for us here on the continent. Thank you for watching. Until next time, goodbye.